time now, though, for the first of our 4 long-form interviews that we're running this month to mark the anniversary of the independence referendum. We'll be looking at the campaign, results and aftermath from various points of view on both sides of the issue, politically and culturally. This week, Gordon Brewer spoke to journalist and Yes campaigner Lesley Riddoch.
Let's start, if we could, with the beginning of the referendum campaign. You were a great champion of the idea of getting people involved in politics. When did it become clear to you for the first time that something a bit unusual was going on here?
Well, probably not at the start of the campaign, to be honest. I think really the thing sort of took off, to be honest. And I can remember the date was sometime in February when George Osborne did his "You Cannae Have the Pound" thing. And I was going a bit of a sore back, and I was off to see an osteopath in Dundee, and he was a very fervent no voter. And when I came in, he said, "Well, that's it all over now." And I assumed he meant that would be, a collapse of confidence on the yes side. And said, do you think people are that easily fooled? And he said, no. He says, that's it, one for the yes side. He said, you don't tell Scots what to do. And he's English. So I kind of thought, now that is a weird one. And the whole day I was getting strange reactions from people, at least not what you'd expect, just completely irritated, actually, by that sort of stand. And then I began to think, there's a different kind of dynamic going on here than I would have expected. And from there on in, it began to gather pace a wee bit. Obviously not enough.
This was when George Osborne came to Edinburgh,
yes,
and made his statement and then wouldn't take any questions and went away again.
What became a fairly typical sort of dynamic on that front. But the effrontery of it just annoyed people a lot. And of course, Osborne was so connected and is so connected to an austerity sort of agenda with the bedroom tax and so on that had really galvanised Scots. Obviously not as much as the poll tax, but certainly had brought people together in a sense of we as a group of people would not, if we were under controlling our own country, would not put through that kind of legislation. That is alien. And here's George Osborne, the king of the aliens, coming up the road to tell us we can't use the pound. So it was a bit of a moment.
Well, we know what your osteopath concluded from that. What did you conclude from it?
Actually, probably much the same. But I'm always tend to think that...
But did that prompt you to get more involved? Initially, weren't you? You were rather reluctant to get involved terribly much, or even to wear a yes badge. I mean, you talk about that reluctance in your book, The Wee White Blossom.
Yeah, well, there was a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I was a journalist and potentially a broadcaster in the area of current affairs. So I had no particular intention for coming out at the beginning so openly and strongly for yes. But I was a panellist on a fairly bizarre Question Time programme, which had both George Galloway and Nigel Farage on either side. So quite a few dancing bears in one programme, actually. And it was made pretty clear that when we were asked a question about our voting intentions, we were expected to say it. And that if we didn't come out with it fairly easily, it would be kind of wheedled out of us. So without really intending to go over the top, I went over the top. So that kind of put me out in the public domain, if you like.
When you say over the top, you said, I'm going to vote yes.
Yes. I said, this is the kind of country I want. It's one that doesn't have Trident. It's one that has a social democratic agenda, a couple of other things, and that means I'm voting yes, because I don't see it happening within the UK.
All right, but if that was almost forced out of you on a television programme, how did you go from that to becoming, in effect, an organiser and a champion of this idea that people who'd not been involved in politics before should become involved? Because
the formal independence thing is only one strand of people being involved in politics. I've been the whole time I worked in the BBC, I was a trustee of the Isle of Egg Trust, leading to, was one of the people that led towards the community buyout there. I, once again, when I was in the BBC, was the founder of Harpies and Quines, a dreadful feminist rag. So for me, being involved in things at a kind of community level has never been a kind of inimical with doing any other type of job. But certainly my kind of hesitancy about wearing yes badges and going to formal events was I kind of expected them to be slightly tomorrow belongs to me, slightly there's a kind of set of ideas that you have to agree with. Everything's going to be good in independence and everything will be rosy. Actually, I went to a lot of events which were locally organised. I've almost never found that. I have to say the making of the independence movement was to some degree the inadequacy of the central Yes campaign. Because since they...
What do you mean?
Well, local branches tended to find that they weren't getting the merchandising they needed, or they weren't getting the kind of briefing they needed, and they were waiting for slogans, banners, whatever. And actually, most of them just decided to roll their own. So there was lots and lots of empowered groups around Scotland who decided not to wait for official instructions, but just devise what they wanted themselves. And that's, to perhaps really answer your question from the start, that's the moment that I began to think something amazing's happening here, because everywhere I went, there was something slightly different. If you went to Glasgow, you would get How No badges. Well, just somebody did that. In fact, it was Ian Black from the Tartan Army. If you went to other places, Orkney, for example, was I Orkney, because they just weren't using the yes word. Those sound like little things, but people were just crafting the campaign to suit what was big for them. And it was a ball going around all those different places. It was like the kind of, particularly the summer, you would never forget, because people were sort of discovering their community at the same time as they were trying to campaign for a yes vote.
And it was your experience as you went around, presumably speaking at events, that a lot of the people who were involved in the Yes campaign weren't the SNP with different hats on.
No, or rather, you're right. There was just a much larger pull-in of people. I can remember, well, of course, it all mixed up slightly with the book tour, but the kind of people that would come in were very often very organised mums, young mums. I think that was probably a very large part of some of the organisation, and they tended to provide events that were zingy, had music, brilliant cakes, which is not a small thing, and just tended to cater for the whole person. It wasn't those kind of stern, didactic, finger-wagging kind of events that people associate with politics.
I've never heard it said that yes cakes were particularly better than no cakes. That's a new one on me.
There just were cakes, that was the point. They were just jolly. You know, it wasn't quite the freezing kind of events that people seem to associate with politics. They were fun.
Presumably at the beginning, even when you became quite evangelical about this, you didn't seriously believe the Yes campaign would win, given the way the polls were. Did your view change as the campaign went on?
I must say, when I was asked, and I would always think that people would sink back somewhat from the more bold position that anyone took. And strangely, that thought was based on doing a programme for Channel 4 for many years called the People's Parliament, in which we had a sort of makey-uppy parliament in the summer when the real one wasn't sitting, formed with people in Manchester. And every time we would put a subject up for debate, the left would win the argument and the right would win the vote. People just didn't like opening up to some of the aspects of hesitancy, selfishness, greed, or affection for the United Kingdom in this case, which sounded kind of, it's the shy Tory idea, perhaps shy no voters. And I assumed that the same dynamic would work in this campaign right up to the last week. It was pretty well that last 51% poll that made me think there was a real possibility that there could be a push over the line.
So you hadn't really entertained that before then?
I probably hadn't thought that it was likely that we would get over 50%. But, you know, as somebody who has been, supportive of many cases, land reform, feminism, many things that you don't expect to see happening very quickly or in your lifetime, that doesn't mean that I don't wholeheartedly support something that I'm not certain will win. But sure, I wasn't able to say hand on heart that I thought it was going to be possible until the last week.
What, in your view, got people involved in a campaign for independence? I mean, obviously there have been over the years campaigns for lots of things, land reform, you've mentioned women's rights, a lot of issues that you are interested in. It's not immediately obvious why independence should be something that should get involved people who hadn't been involved in politics before.
It's right enough, because, I mean, if you could think of the largest, most likely turn-off in politics, I would say constitutional affairs would be it. But then that's not how this was perceived. I mean, I think Jim Sillars said it, and he was very right, that for 10 hours, the people of Scotland held the entire future of this country in their hands. And power is an aphrodisiac. I mean, as soon as people realised this was a real vote, not to be mediated by any politicians, not to be gerrymandered away later, but this was a real outcome.
You see, I can see why that, in fact, what you're saying is pretty much what John Curtis, the psephologist, says about why there was such a high turnout, that people realised this was very important, so they would vote. But that doesn't really explain why people wanted to get involved on the ground, does it?
Possibly not, except that, yes, I mean, I think the thing is, in a way, I see a wee parallel with the Jeremy Corbyn thing here. Jeremy Corbyn is kind of a vessel that is at the moment being blown along by people who actually want conversations and debates which are not the things they're hearing in the mainstream. And independents benefited from that too, at least the pro-yes cause, because suddenly there was a blossoming of all sorts of things, which I may be uncharitable, but I didn't see on the no side. So unsayable things suddenly seemed to be able to be said. There were people coming out of the woodwork with tremendous talent, whether they were doing skits, whether they were doing cartoons or online newspapers. The whole gamut was suddenly there. And it was as if basically people realised that they could have a voice for that moment across a whole number of platforms, which previously had been a bit staid.
After that 51% poll, did you change your mind?
No, actually. I mean, that just shows you why you should never bet on anything I back, because I know that the received wisdom is that the 51% scared the bejesus out of the no camp. They got their act together, hauled everyone up the road, got Gordon Brown out, and the rest was history. I don't know. Obviously, there was some impact from all of that. And the kind of fear campaign that was running around the last week, where everything, including the Loch Ness Monster, would basically be migrating south, would be enough to kind of wobble the sternest person. So I still thought, however, and maybe that's the yes bubble which has often been described, I still thought that there was a possibility there would be just a yes vote, just narrowly, and was very disappointed when it wasn't.
Well, I was going to ask you, what were you doing on the night of the result, and when did you start to think that perhaps it wasn't going to happen?
Well, I went through, I was in the BBC studios, actually, being a sort of commentator for much of the night, it felt. And as I left Edinburgh, I can remember thinking, as I saw the sign going in the car across on the motorway, the next time I see the word Edinburgh, this will be an independent country, which of course it was never going to be that fast anyway. But just in a way, I suppose I was trying to kind of pump up a sort of sense of moment. I'd spent the day drifting around here with watching young people wandering around with saltires and yes badges, and as if they'd actually already moved into a different country. The area around here was quite extraordinary. And then as soon as I got in, and in fact it was Clackmannan, wasn't it? The first result that came in, and the Ochels, that was clearly went the wrong way. And suddenly there was just that kind of thump feeling where you began to realise it wasn't going to be that good a night after all.
How did you feel when you realised that the Yes campaign had lost?
A bit sort of numb, really. It was as if it was just like going back to a very mundane sort of reality suddenly. And the kind of heady aspects of things seemed to have gone. And suddenly it was just like any other election, any other person trying to explain away a defeat, any other moment you've been disappointed in your life. You just went back to a very narrow, mundane, straightforward, just working by parrot fashion till the interviews were over. To be honest, I was a bit stunned.
But of course it wasn't quite as simple as that, was it? Because the thing that you seem to put value on almost more than the actual result is the getting people involved in the campaign. Now, initially at least, that seemed to continue, didn't it? I mean, Women for Independence, for example, were claiming they were having meetings of 500 people. In the weeks after the election, there was that huge rally that Nicola Sturgeon attended. There was a big radical independence campaign rally in Glasgow. Did it surprise you that while the result, from your point of view, was the wrong one, the campaign almost just continued?
Yes, it did. Again, this is my inner Scot, perhaps being slightly pessimistic. You'd like to think this would all be the case, but people have jobs. We'd gone out of the summer. There was a defeat there. And the degree to which people were just not seeming to accept it was really quite extraordinary. I would never have expected quite that degree of tenacity and quite that degree of focus, of energy suddenly straight into the SNP. I mean, lots of people, when they were asked when they decided to vote SNP in the general election, said the 19th of September. It was as quick as that people thought, we can't express things that way, we'll do it this way. But in terms of that activism, it's still going. I spoke at a meeting this week that had 250 people in it on a Wednesday night in Aberdeen. It's bizarre.
What kind of meeting?
It was an SNP branch meeting, which was large. It was just enlarged to include anyone who wanted to come. I'm not a member of the SNP, and that's significant. Many of the branches I've spoken at have never had a non-SNP member speak to them. And you'd better believe I'm pretty critical of lots of SNP policy. So there's a strange thing happening where I think so many people of that 70,000 who joined the SNP after independence had an existence in the wider movements where they weren't very formal, they're not very restrictive, they don't tell you what you can and can't do. They're very come-all-ye. You're sitting next to a Green person there and an SNP person there and a Commonweal person there and a Women for Indie person. And many people go to all of these meetings. So the SNP has had an influx of tremendously broad-minded people who are not going to draw the line at anybody simply because they're not a party member.
But has that wider campaign continued? I mean, the Women for Independence, the National Collective, you don't hear so much about them anymore.
National Collective, I think, not so much. You're right. Women for Independence, absolutely. I spend my life trailing around the place very happily, speaking to Women for Independence branches. They've got 12 in Ayrshire alone. There's 72 branches of
12 branches,
Commonweal.
not 12 women.
No, they might have one each. But no, and they do things like I think, really useful things, like they've got a lot of book clubs, because I think a lot of people, never mind women, began to realise how little they knew about Scotland, how little they knew about certain aspects of politics. And it's almost like a kind of huge adult education self-help group course that people have set up where anyone who's written books that seem relevant are asked to go around and talk to tremendously now well-read people. And again, as another sign of things that I would not have expected to see, many of the meetings I've gone to organised by Women for Independence are half full of men.
What about the other side of this? You were excited by the fact that people who hadn't been involved in politics before became involved. But was there an element of sort of self-kidology, if you like, in the ground campaign? I mean, one of the accusations against groups like National Collective is what you ended up with was a big bunch of people who were all convinced of the cause, sitting around talking to each other and convincing themselves that everyone else was convinced of the cause rather than actually going and converting people.
Well, yes. I mean, the National Collective went on a Yestival tour, which I caught up with in the middle of doing my own wee tour with Angus Brendan McNeill in the Western Isles. And it was there was many tours. It was like, those cross trails you get in the sky, lots and lots of people on tour charging all over the place. And for sure, there would definitely be more people who are yes-inclined coming to it. But I'm not quite sure, short of stopping and going to perhaps pensioners' clubs, how you could have approached more people than folk did.
No, but it's always a danger with political campaigns. I mean, it's one of the accusations that's made against, and we can come on to talk a bit about Corbynism in a moment, but one of the accusations against the Corbynistas is that there are a lot of them, they have enthused a lot of people, but essentially they're talking to themselves, not to the wider public. And there must have been an element of that in the
There is,
campaign.
but how do you speak to the wider public, short of setting up events, making them free, standing in the street without a megaphone shouting at people, and doing all sorts of free events anywhere you like. I went to many events that, for example, Radical Independence organised, clever locations. I spoke in one at Easter House, which was designed to attract women who were just about to pick their bairns up from school, and they'd managed to find an empty shop premises, not too difficult there. It was Castle Milk, forgive me, which was right beside the school. And it was one of the most exciting but difficult events I've ever been at, because it was like a hill mart, as my mother would have said. There was women coming in and shouting at their children across the road, sort of listening to you for about a minute, then getting fed up, going away to speaking to someone else, then coming back with a thing that they'd thought about. I've never been anything like that in my life. It was totally challenging, and there was probably 200 women all in all there, and about 5 million children. So I don't know how much more you could have done, and I think you could really credit people like Radical Independence for having gone well beyond what any party had done, the SNP included, in deciding that areas like Easterhouse, Castlemilk were there to be canvassed like anything else, going on mass canvasses in which the key word was fun, so that people were actually having a bit of a kind of good time going en masse rather than the two trepidatious people hoping there's no dogs in, which is the usual canvassing technique. And new ways of working have been forged, which are still going. You know, the formation of RISE, which is come out of radical independence with the Scottish Socialists, is a sort of left grouping, which I think will probably be a very viable one because it's got the organisational skills of those guys behind it.
Well, we'll talk about maybe RISE later on, but let's talk a little bit about the SNP, because despite all the enthusiasm of the Yes campaign, there was a problem, do you think, with the benefit of hindsight, that arguably what the SNP was proposing simply wasn't very coherent. I mean, you mentioned George Osborne coming up and alienating people by saying that independent Scotland couldn't have the pound. But the fact of the matter is that none of the political parties other than the SNP said that Scotland could keep the pound. So we were being asked to vote for an independent country on an economic prospectus that everybody else who actually would make the decisions was saying simply wasn't going to happen. Now, if there ever is another campaign, surely that sort of thing would have to be rethought, wouldn't it?
I think so. I think it was well, there was always going to be a difficulty whichever way you played it, really, on the currency. If there'd been an intention of having a separate currency, that would have been shot down as something likely to produce some sort of Icelandic crash, you know, with a small country ready to be picked off for the first time it had a problem. But I suspect, actually, if Nicola Sturgeon had been in charge then, there might have been a different policy, because I think there's something in Alex's personality that quite enjoyed the idea of saying, you can't actually stop us from using that. And he's right. But actually that's not enough to make people feel secure.
Sure, but a year after the referendum result, the SNP still haven't formulated a different policy.
They haven't, because I think, in all honesty, they've no intention of racing to the polls, hence the decision not to include another referendum in their manifesto. But what happened was, I mean, I think, in all fairness, the SNP were stunned to see the victory that they got in 2011. They probably thought they were going to have more time actually governing before they were having a run for the line for the referendum. And they had to quickly pull together some policies for how they would overcome these things. Now, they didn't really, they were canvassing amongst themselves, but by the time we came to the referendum, there was a much wider yes campaign. Now, that much wider yes campaign wasn't there at the start when they made their decisions. So to be fair to them, right at the beginning, when Alex Salmond lit the touch paper, they were on their own with it.
But can you understand that for many people who voted no, there was just a slight air of unreality about the yes campaign? I mean, one of the things that you say on the economy in your book, The Wee White Blossom, is you deplore the behaviour of, companies who were threatening to withdraw from Scotland should it vote for independence. And you say, do Scots want an economy that relies on companies like these? And the obvious question is, what are you suggesting? That we just say to all the big banks and the big insurance companies, oh, we'll have a different sort of economy, get lost?
Well, yes. I mean, you've obviously got to accept at face value whatever companies want to say. But I mean, if you were to think that we have got a very temporary residence of companies which are nonetheless the mainstay of Scotland, I think that would cause you some alarm whether we're in the UK or independent. Many of the problems that were being cited as problems if we became independent are still problems for us. It's still a problem for the UK, for example, if the oil price has fallen. All the things that were seen as utterly impossible to deal with for an independent Scotland are problems that we experience still. So do we want to be a branch economy? Probably not. Do we want to manage to engineer a lot more homegrown industry? Yes, we probably do. Might we want more state-owned things? If you were to look across the channel to Norway, you'd see a different model completely for how to run things.
But the companies that were threatening to at least partially withdraw, like Standard Life, aren't part of a branch economy. These are companies which are Scottish to their core.
Well, we could all have arguments about how Scottish many of the companies are that seem to have left a plaque here under operating in large part from other parts of the UK or even from Europe. But sure, I mean, I'm not arguing that anybody wants to get rid of Standard Life. I'm saying, is this okay for everybody that we have companies that would so likely think they would leave? And remember, Gordon, I mean, we're all old enough to remember the long list of companies that were going to leave if there was devolution. So, it's a kind of once bitten, twice shy thing here. Do we want to stay in this situation where we're led by business? I know they're important, but we've got to a situation, and again, maybe Corbyn's part of it, where people, I think, have got sick of this now. And much as people were nervous because there's so much was thrown into that sack, it wasn't just the prospect of companies walking, it was the prospect of pensions not being paid. There was all sorts of financial worries.
The other thing that a lot of people would be a bit sceptical about, one of the things you say in your book is that most folk, you say, on the yes side were actively involved somehow, whether it be in booking halls, speaking at meetings and all the rest of it. But surely that just wasn't true. I mean, the vast majority of people who voted yes in the independence referendum just turned out and voted yes. They didn't actually get involved.
Yes, in hindsight, that's probably true. I mean, 1.6 million people, I think, voted yes, and I'm not quite sure the world had quite that many stalls. I think, however, everybody was probably quite close to somebody within a family or within a household or within an interest group who they knew that was out there doing something. Now, yes, absolutely, that's not the same as stampeding down the streets. But when you looked at the kind of number of people that were out for things and the wide network you could call on to do almost anything, you ended up getting into a kind of extended yes group. I mean, I would turn up for things a bit like the Queen without money. You didn't need money because people would help you with whatever you needed when you turned up somewhere. So, of course, it wasn't everybody that was out in the streets.
But again, see, the problem with this is it's very common. It doesn't have to be the Independence, the Yes campaign. A lot of leftist campaigns in the past have been like this. You turn up, everyone chips in for the train fare, all that sort of thing. And it's like a big network. And you end up convincing yourself that the whole world is changing. No. But actually it isn't.
You don't need the whole world to change in a democracy, Gordon. You need 51%. Now, we got 51% at one point, and that could have been a big change. And I agree. Of course, in a book, there's sloppy phrasing. Most, everyone, that many, whatever. But the point is that when you look around the place, from my experience of doing stuff for many years on many issues, there was infinitely more people at things than I expected, and they were infinitely more ready to help. And the stories of people who had gone just so far out of their comfort zone, I know quickly people began to find that banal because they heard it a couple of times. And actually, there's something in the Scots that they don't want to hear this good news story and all these cheesy Pollyanna stories of people turning up ready to help and, carrying each other on their backs. I'm sorry, it was true.
Well, if you told them about the cakes, they might have liked that, you see.
Well, there you are. It all sounds just a wee bit couthy, but that actually is a much nicer environment to be in, and that's what I think is important because it created the next phase of politics. Well, because it was so nasty. The other side.
Let me pick you up on the next phase, because the next phase was that the SNP at the general election clearly benefited massively from the campaign we've been talking about. Did it disappoint you that really, so far, it's only really the SNP who've benefited from the campaign that we've been talking about?
Yes. I had suggested that there should be a Yes Alliance standing for the general election, which would have been a kind of reincarnation of the spirit of the Yes campaign, so that it wasn't just one party that dominated. But I think that was probably a sort of a hopeful gesture too far, because the SNP were poised to clean up. In a first-past-the-post system, you were never going to get much traction for any of the smaller parties. It's never happened. And I think Scots by that stage had decided they really wanted to say something to Westminster. Don't take us for a ride just because we voted no. Well, the easiest way to do that was to kind of everyone get behind the SNP in much the same way as in 1997 that was done by everyone voting out Tories. I mean, we should have got a Nobel Prize for that. It's hard.
You should forgive people. You could forgive people in the leadership of the SNP if they thought the Greens and the radical left and the wider Yes campaign were, to use a phrase that Lenin seems never actually to have used, useful idiots, that they created a great brouhaha and excitement around the fringes. But at the end of the day, it was the SNP what got the gains.
Very possibly, but those useful idiots are now members of the SNP. A great number of, and that's not entryism, that's just simply that anybody who felt motivated to join the SNP had very often been warmed up by the, quote, useful idiots. It was, in a sense, the engagement was very often from those movement groups rather than the formal SNP. And so the folk who are in the SNP today are not quite the same as the SNP members of yesteryear. It remains to be seen at their conference how that will all pan out. It looks on the face of it like a pretty safe one. It looks like some more ruckus motions have not been allowed through. But the people who are coming forward as delegates will have the capacity to do differently if they're brave enough. And it is bravery that you need to be able to change the direction of a party that's in a year for Holyrood elections. There's very strong don't rock the boat stuff going on right now. And it would be a brave person that would rock that boat in the face of people warning them that they know how to win elections, and you don't win elections by raising difficult issues.
You've mentioned Jeremy Corbyn several times. You've brought him up, not me.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Jeremy Corbyn, because one of the things that strikes me about your writing is that it seems to me that the thing you put value on most is getting people involved, almost more than the content of what they're involved in. So what would you say to an excited young Corbynista who says, look, I'm not interested in I mean, for example, for Corbyn, independence for Scotland is simply irrelevant to the way he thinks. But he is exciting hundreds of thousands of people up and down the country. Why isn't that an equally valid movement to the Yes movement?
It is equally valid.
But it doesn't want anything to do with the Yes movement.
But it's equally valid. I'm sorry, I'm not part of a party. I just don't do these grid lines. And there's a lot of folk out there like me. I think, Jeremy Corbyn is allowing a lot of English people to have conversations they couldn't have. I hear that from friends who've met him. Some of them say they don't even really know who Jeremy Corbyn is. He's a cipher that allows people to begin to think the unthinkable and to be able to discuss, well, I don't know, should we nationalise the railways?
But if that were transformed into a movement that included Scotland in some campaign for a left-wing Labour government and that made the whole independence thing irrelevant, would you regret that?
No, actually, because you're quite right. I'm a great believer in democracy in that way. And if people are engaged and thinking through stuff, I'm quite happy to see what the majority's verdict is. But here's the thing. I have very serious doubts that any of the ifs in your sentence there will come to pass. I doubt that Jeremy Corbyn would become Prime Minister. I'm not sure quite what support he'll receive in Scotland. I'm not sure he'll take the whole of the Labour Party with him, and it might be useful for them to split, actually, because they seem to be quite profoundly split. I'm not sure where that'll leave us.
Where do we go from here? Your idea of more involvement in politics, what do you see as championing that now? Do you see the SNP doing it? Do you see the Corbyn campaign doing it? Do you see the Radical Independence campaign? What happens to the movement?
It's a very good question, really, because a lot of the movement has backed the SNP. And I do suspect that as the SNP doesn't look liable to challenge some of the big structural problems we have in Scotland, of inequality that you've alluded to, and of inequitable distribution of land and so on, and the centralising tendencies, I think some people will want to come back out of it. To what? Labour? Scottish Labour? Jim Murphy tried to pick up some of these issues. He talked in a rather waffly way about trying to pull power out of Holyrood into towns, but his idea was simply to have talking shops. If Labour ever had the courage to think of advocating a return to powerful municipal government, which is actually what every social democracy at our latitude has done, they would perhaps find some traction. Now, that's a long, long way off, because for most of the Yes campaign, there's no way they're going to drift back towards Labour. So there's space. There is political space at the moment for something. Whether Rise is going to fill all of it, I don't know. But there's space for something, and it hasn't yet come into being.
Do you think in 10 years' time Scotland will be independent, or do you think independence will not be seen as the most important issue, as you yourself seem to suggest it isn't in some of your writing?
I think it will be the most important issue, because I think Britain is incapable of reforming itself. And the stronger that we get a push from all sorts of directions to say the House of Lords is just an embarrassment, the levels of inequality are intolerable, the idea that people in the Department of Work and Pensions are being issued with suicide guidelines, the sanction stuff that comes out every day. I'm ashamed to be living under this kind of regime. And if my thought in life to be happy living here is that I'm working towards something which, at least in Scotland, that has voted, generally speaking, in a different direction for almost 100 years, is to find a way out. And if I thought there was a way out in Britain, as someone who was born in England, brought up in Northern Ireland, went to university in England and Wales, I'm not a natural nationalist at all. But I have no confidence, having been right down there, worked in London, worked in the Commons in my journalistic days, I have no confidence that the establishment is up for change anytime soon. And that means one course, which is independence.
All right, Lesley Riddoch, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.